Welcome to the Triage Method Podcast Q&A edition with me, Gary McGowan, and my co-host, Mr. Patrick Farrell. How are you this Thursday, Paddy?
I am positively fantastic as per usual, Gary, because it's
Fantastic.
actually Sunday and we just recorded the last one mere moments ago.
Yeah, I know, but look, I'm trying to make it look like we're on the telly, It's like people are following along. It's like, you're
Uh,
back again. Welcome back, guys. But anyway, Q&A edition, so that means we're answering a question. And this is actually a client-specific question that I have gotten from a client recently. And that relates to protein supplementation, whey protein supplementation in particular. And basically, kind of the question about like, is it bad if I have, multiple scoops a day? Is that a bad thing? Is there an upper limit? Is there a point at which we say, okay, maybe you should stop consuming extra whey protein? Because I think one of the things I recall hearing a lot, and you still do hear it about protein supplementation, is that it's kind of like a last resort thing. It's like if you can't get enough in your diet, okay, have an extra bit of whey protein, but otherwise you want to get it mostly from your diet. And like that's a kind of a fine heuristic, because what it forces you to do is make sure you're actually thinking about the composition of your meals, and it ensures that you're not doing things like just having a few Pop-Tarts and then a scoop of whey protein and calling it a meal. You're actually thinking about cooking meals, you're thinking about preparing meals, thinking about what you're going to eat in advance and the other components of the meal itself. So in that sense, I think it's a sound heuristic to tell people that, think of protein as a last resort kind of thing. But I think that can sometimes leave the impression for people that, if the rest of their diet is actually in order and they could benefit from extra whey protein, that they kind of have to be, they're kind of uncertain. They're like, I'm not sure if I should go for it or if it's just the last resort. And also it can leave the impression that whey protein isn't that great. And in fact, it's like a really, really high quality protein source. Like dairy protein in general is very high quality protein. And when you kind of get the whey protein in particular, very high quality protein. So it's not something that, like, that's not a comment that people make to say that it's not a high quality protein, because it is. So in terms of whey protein in general, it's a very high quality protein. It's something that, as part of your diet, is going to contribute very well to your protein intake, and also can be a really nice supplement to certain meals in general. So whether it be adding to your porridge or a smoothie or even milk for your cereal, etc. So it's quite versatile in that sense. But in this particular context, I have a client who prefers eating like only two main meals per day, and would basically like to be able to fill the gaps in terms of both the gaps in terms of the total protein intake and maybe another protein feeding by just having a protein shake or two, that would just make their life easier to be able to just add in the extra protein in that form. So in that sense, what there are a couple of considerations that would make me kind of double check that, okay, have we taken care of everything else? And that's just like, are the rest of the meals adequate? Is the person eating two meals a day because they like, let's say, binge eating on processed hyper palatable foods, and then they're low in protein, so they have to fill the gaps with whey protein? That's one context this can come up. And in that case, I'm thinking, actually, I prefer that you adjusted the composition of your other meals so that they were, more whole food based, like you had some sort of deliberate protein source, and you had your fiber sources, and you had your fruits and vegetables, etc. And then see what's left. But if someone's saying, look, I'm eating an omelet in the morning, I've got vegetables in the omelet, I have two pieces of fruit on the side and some whole grain toast, and then in the evening I'm having, I don't know, a chicken breast and a salmon fillet and potatoes, and I've got some beans and I've got some vegetables. Like, and I'm looking at those meals and I'm thinking, God, this person is clearly making an effort to have a healthful diet pattern overall. From what I can see, everything is taken care of. So the protein is on top of that is purely additive in terms of contributing to health and contributing to satiety and hence body composition goals, and muscle building, etc. So in that context, I'm saying, yeah, this additional protein is definitely beneficial. So in that case, if someone needs to have 3 scoops of whey protein to get their protein up to a higher level, even if it's above the standard threshold, like let's say the 6 grams per kilo is going to be beneficial for muscle building. That's kind of like the the level that we'd say, yeah, that's going to cover a lot, most people. But if someone wants to bump up to 2.5 grams per kilo, because let's say they're in a deficit of calories, of energy, and they want to ensure that they're full, and the extra protein is kind of a reserve, and they're saying, look, I'd like to have 3 scoops of protein per day to satisfy that. Once the rest of their diet is in order and they're not just using this as a cover up for a poor diet overall, like I'm pretty happy for someone to add that in. I don't see a problem with it. I see it as being a high quality protein source that also, has other benefits for health in terms of things like the antioxidant system, glutathione synthesis, etc. So I mean, I see it as part of a healthy diet pattern. I see no problem with having a few scoops of protein per day to supplement. What do
Yeah,
you
like
think, Paddy?
there's a few like considerations that you've touched on there for this, but ultimately, I think it comes down to the looking at the overall diet itself rather than just the protein shakes
Yeah,
themselves.
exactly.
Because first of all, we have to take into account like, where are we in relation to our protein targets? Like as you were saying there, Gary, like, well, we basically can be like, right, if we want to be the most generous with our recommendations, if you're getting between 1 and 3 grams per kilo on like your protein, you're probably okay. Like ideally, the one I would be more hesitant to suggest, But if we're talking about, just frank deficiency, I'd be like, at least get 1 gram per kilo, like just get that, like that's the bare minimum. But I'm probably usually someone that falls around the kind of 2 to 2.2. That's generally where I'm like, that's where I find the sweet spot, obviously with the populations that we talk to and we train and coach and whatever else. So are we talking about the individual using whey protein or protein powders in general? Because there are obviously different types. There's pea protein, there's vegan proteins, there's egg proteins, beef proteins. Like, so there are different types. But if we're just talking about milk proteins in some form, like maybe a milk protein powder itself, or a casein protein powder, or a whey protein powder, like we have to look at those things in terms of being food sources themselves, right? And you wouldn't say like, oh, don't add that protein source to that meal because it's a bad protein source. So we have to look at it in terms of the overall diet pattern and what's going on and what makes sense then for that diet pattern, right? And like we said, like if you are talking to an individual that is eating just pure crap food in general, like they're literally just eating like white bread and crackers and just really like ultra processed carb sources,
Yeah.
and they're like, oh, I just have a few scoops of whey per day to pretty much hit my target. I don't eat any other protein sources. That's obviously going to be different than someone that says to you, they're like, yeah, I'm actually usually about 20 grams off my protein target, but I'm eating fish a few times per week. I'm eating red meat a few times per week. I'm eating, white meat here. Their overall diet pattern is good. It's what you recommend, and they're just a little bit off the target. The quantities, they don't have the hunger for it, or like you said, that individual, they're like, I only really like to eat twice per day. In that case, having a protein shake, who cares? Like it's literally just adding to the diet. It's allowing you to hit your targets, right? However, if we're in the case where it's like you're relying on protein powder to get the entirety of your protein intake, then that's probably not a great position to be in, right? So even though we can go, oh yes, the protein powder, it has all these benefits, it's a great protein source, great spectrum of amino acids, has all these other benefits, depending on the protein source it is. Like if we're talking about whey, we can talk about glutathione. If we're talking about milk proteins themselves, we can be like calcium intake, and like there's objective benefits to these different protein powder sources. So again, we could look at it like that. However, I'm hesitant to recommend someone have like one source of protein in the diet. So if we're talking about that, I wouldn't be necessarily recommending that, and I would be, like you said earlier on, recommending a little bit of a change in the dietary pattern and be like, right, we actually need to work on these meals, because you're hitting your targets, you're hitting your macronutrient intake, you're hitting your calorie intake, so we're not in a bad place there by any stretch of the imagination. However, this is probably not the most healthful the diet could be. So we maybe want to change change the meal composition, the food choices around there a little bit, you know. But if it's in the context of someone that eats generally well, I don't have a huge issue. It can also be really beneficial in terms of, you know, like you said, this individual, they only want to eat twice per day. Maybe we want to have a third protein feeding at some other point in the day just to keep hunger where it needs to be, you know, relative to the other stuff's going on, like calories and whatever else. But also just to get that like muscle protein synthesis going on. It might make sense to just have a protein shake at some other point in the day, you know, just so we're like, yeah, we're at least getting 3 protein feedings at a few time points throughout the day, you know, and that could be beneficial. Again, it could also be beneficial to just get your protein feedings in at those 2 time points. And, you know, maybe you are some individual that has a very high calorie and protein requirement. Maybe you're 300 pounds, shredded to the bone, bodybuilder, and you have a really demanding job and you can't eat on shift and you can literally only eat once in the morning and then in the evening or something like that, you know, then it can be very hard to get whatever, I don't know, 300, 400 grams of protein in per day, you know. So it's like maybe your protein intake is just very high, and because you also have a restricted feeding window, you know, maybe we do need to wash these meals down with a protein shake, you know, or maybe potentially slip another protein shake or 2 or 3 scoops or whatever it is in at some point throughout the day, you know, just so we can, you can plug it down while you're working in your, I don't know, steel factory or whatever the fuck it is. So yeah, I'm not like, people make a big deal out of this, and I'm just like, it's just you wouldn't say it about milk. You wouldn't just be like, oh, you shouldn't drink milk for protein. Now you might say that again with the fat intake and the carbohydrate intake or lactose intolerance or the overall calories of it. But if we're like, yeah, this is just milk protein, like you're not going to say that that's bad for most people, you know. Well, some people might be like, oh, milk, you know, it's not great, you know. But in general, it's like, this is just another protein source. As long as the rest of the diet, we're pretty much just focusing on our general recommendations. Like, I couldn't care less if someone is like, yeah, I have 2 scoops of whey protein per day just to help me hit my targets, because I find it hard to, I don't know, eat a load of chicken breasts or beef or whatever. Or maybe they're from a lower socioeconomic status and they just struggle to have enough money to pay for meat sources, you know, because meat is probably the more expensive of the dietary, you know, composites, the things that make up your diet. Whereas like a bag of whey protein, you could buy fucking 10 kilos of the stuff and, you know, get it for really cheap, you know. And so that might represent something that makes sense. Like, yeah, obviously it's a bigger investment upfront. Like, it's like €70 for a 5 kilo bag or whatever. But that 5 kilo bag might, you know, represent 4 months of food, you know, for you, or longer even, you know. So again, when you average it out over the days, it might actually work out cheaper based on wherever you are from and, you know, the foods that you have available to you. So again, I'm not going to argue against that. If this individual is like, I just don't have the money to do, you know, to be eating, you know, all these good cuts of meat, these leaner cuts of meat or whatever. And as a result, you know, they have to focus on fattier cuts of meat because generally they're a little bit cheaper, you know, and they're like, yeah, I find it hard to stay within my calories then and hit my protein. So I have to have 2 protein shakes per day. In that case, I'm not going to argue against that. We have a clear rationale. We have a clear logical reasoning as to why that is the case, that we are doing this. And the overall pattern of the diet is pretty much on point. You know, I have no issue with that being the case, you know, if it makes sense. The only time I really have an issue is if we're eating shit and then going, oh shit, yeah, I have to hit my protein intake. So I just glug down 6 scoops of whey protein. I'm like, you're not actually trying to be on point with the diet at all. You're just, you know, making an easier choice rather than the right choice.
Yeah, 100%. And like another context where this becomes like, or there's a couple actually, like one is traveling. So sometimes if you're traveling, maybe you're concerned about the quality of the meat or something, you know, depending on where you are in the world. Like I go to Belarus every year, and I mean the meat in the local shop, like it's not great. So
Shad Irish beef.
No, it's not, it's definitely not Irish beef. And when you see it kind of sitting out and stuff, it's just, yeah, it's not very appetizing. So, in that case, I'm like more inclined to maybe have a bit more whey protein. I do actually bring meat with me as well, but obviously, if you're going traveling like around Asia or something, you're not going to bring meat with you. But yeah, depending on where you are in the world, you might have your concerns about the hygiene associated with meat consumption and not having the same quality of meat that we have in Ireland. So in those cases, maybe you might want to have more whey protein, and of course that's completely justified. So if you're traveling or something like that, totally makes sense to have more. And also, like, when you're traveling, you're probably going to want to, you want to have more ice creams, and you're probably having a couple of drinks and stuff like that. So I mean, if you're thinking of overall calories, maybe you want to also just be like, yeah, I'm just going to cover my protein needs with some whey protein, and that's fine over the short term. Not a big deal. Another context is obviously vegetarian or even pescatarian diets. And vegan diets, but obviously if you're a vegan, you're not going to be consuming whey, but you can have another type of protein to cover those bases. But if you're an individual like that who's on a more restrictive diet, and you are trying to obviously compete in some sort of sport or resistance training or whatever, sometimes hitting your protein target overall can be quite challenging. And I think like people downplay this sometimes because they say, oh yeah, but you can just eat peanut butter and stuff and it's just fine. But it's like, yeah, but if someone's on a calorie restricted diet as well as having these food restrictions in place, that makes it a lot harder then, to hit that total protein intake. So sometimes having a supplemental protein source in those cases can be really helpful, and you might actually need more. Like one of my friends, he's an MMA fighter, and does a lot of resistance training as well. And one of the downfalls that like for him is very clearly like he probably doesn't get enough protein in his diet in general. He's a vegetarian, eats really well, great diet pattern. But for someone like him, like supplemental protein would be really beneficial in terms of like his sporting performance and his recovery, etc. So yeah, that is something he does now. But he actually, I think he said that at one point, like, what do you think about, do you think there's too much? Is it grand? Whatever. So those are contexts where this can become important too. And obviously, yourself, like if you're like, even if you're a pescatarian and you do eat fish, it might be the case that, yeah, you eat fish, but there's some cases where maybe it mightn't be socially appropriate. Let's say you mightn't want to pull out your fish meal on the train or whatever. So you might want to have an alternative option available. I'd have no problem with someone doing that, but some people do. And yeah, yeah, just literally don't care. But yeah, basically, like, you kind of know yourself. Like, you see what your protein intake is on average. And I mean, if you're on a plant-based diet and you're saying to yourself, yeah, I'm getting like 1.2, 1.3 grams per kilo, and I'm an athlete, and yeah, I might benefit from more, but I might be fine. It's like, yeah, you're probably better to just add in a couple of scoops. Like, it's certainly no harm. And when there's already a consideration about the quality of your protein on plant-based diets, then it's just insurance really to push it up another bit. So there's some extra cases where I think this can be particularly useful.
Yeah, and obviously, again, as we discussed just on this, there are multiple types of protein powder, like pea protein,
Oh yeah, for sure.
egg protein, beef protein, whey protein, milk protein. There's different fucking hydroisolates and fucking whatever else. So there are options, because there's cases where you maybe you are, I know one of my friends, he's from Africa, like from Nigeria, and he just notices that he just doesn't handle whey protein well, even though like obviously the lactose content of that is quite low, and there is still some in it. And he knows he doesn't get really any GI upset, but he gets like some spots and stuff, and just doesn't do well with it. So I was just recommending. I was like, okay, go for a beef protein then, because he was trying out a pea protein. He was like, I don't really like the texture of it. It just doesn't. He didn't like it. I like try out a beef, loves it, works well for him. So like there are different options out there for you depending on your situation, depending on your needs. So again, like if it's a case where you need a little bit extra protein and your overall diet patterns are good, take the protein shake. It's not a big deal.
It's not a big deal. It's just food, like.
Yeah. So Gary, when do we collect our checks from Big Protein? Yeah.
Next week, Patrick. Next week.
Don't worry, I'll edit this out. I'll edit it out later.
Of course, yeah. But yeah, like for personal context, like I actually do consume like quite a bit of whey protein purely because like that client, a lot of the time I actually like just consuming like 2 meals a day, which is weird because I used to be like the total opposite. Like I used to be the type of person where like anything less than 4 meals a day just seemed really weird. So I probably average like 3 meals a day a lot of the time, but a lot of the time then I'm just like, if I'm having a morning where I'm doing like a lot of writing or something, I'm generally like, no, I just kind of want to eat 2 meals because the way that it kind of fits in with my like jujitsu schedule and like eating in the evening, etc., it just makes sense a lot of the time to have 2 meals, and maybe I'll supplement that then with some additional whey protein, maybe an hour or two before the workout, and maybe a Lucozade Sport around the workout or whatever. But yeah, I do have definitely a good few scoops of whey per day a lot of the time. So yeah, there's my skin in the game. If you die, I die. It's fine.
But yes, I see no issue with this. Have the fucking scoop away if you need it. Have it at every meal if you need it. That's
Food.
perfectly fine. It's literally just a food source. Yeah, I have nothing really else to say. Obviously, we're saying this in the context of you're buying like higher quality whey protein or protein powders in general. Like if you're buying some fucking random Chinese brand that's, people have been complaining about heavy metal toxicity from it. Like that's obviously a fucking different consideration than if you're like,
for sure.
oh, this brand is fucking from, I don't know, Glanbia or something. And, it's from Irish dairies. You actually can fucking trace the dairy. You can fucking go down to the farm if you want. Like that's obviously a different circumstance, So basically what I'm saying is buy high quality where possible. Like obviously there are also like bulk, companies that you can buy it from, like My Protein, bulk powders, different things like that. Again, depending on wherever you are, which you can buy relatively cheap, and high quality protein powders. Like My Protein always comes out like one of the top when you look at any like the analyses they do. So like even though it's cheap or cheaper, especially if you get a deal on top of it, you're still getting high quality product at the end of it. So happy days, but yeah, I would just caveat it with saying like we obviously want to get high quality where possible. Now, I just wanted to finish this out by saying that there might be some considerations where having a high intake of one source, like say you're having 4 scoops of whey protein per day, that might be a bad thing for some individuals. Again, like I said with the my Nigerian friend there, like maybe you do notice there's some like lactose stuff going on, and you're like, oh, I'm getting some GI upset from this. Just treat it like any other food. If you know this food is causing digestive issues or whatever, then take it out or reduce the quantities or whatever. Play around with the intake, but don't just keep consuming it because you're like, oh yeah, it's good for me. Like if it's causing issues, don't consume it. Same again, if you notice that, I don't know, whey protein, some of them have like relatively high calcium intake. Like I was saying to Gary earlier on, like you can get into these really fucking esoteric, like 1 in a million things that happen. Like you might be like, oh, I take whey protein, but I have a generally high dairy intake or generally high calcium intake overall anyway. And now I have, excessive amounts of calcium, and I don't know, my SHBG now is being influenced. It's increased because of my calcium intake, or and as a result I have less free testosterone, and as a result I'm getting less gains. And it's like you can you can see, you can read, you can fucking find out all of these random niche reasons as to why an individual shouldn't have this high intake or shouldn't take this or shouldn't eat this, but that's an individual thing, So again, I would just be hesitant to base all of my diet pattern around one food source. You're probably better off getting it from a mixed food source. But I also wouldn't be too concerned about wondering whether you are that 1 in a million person that has these potentially random conditions that lead to, like, again, like you might be like, oh, I actually think I need to get more protein in my diet, and you've always had a lower protein diet, and then you have a whey protein shake up and you end up in A&E or something because you find out that you actually have an inborn error in protein metabolism. Like this stuff does happen, and people are like, oh, see, fuck, this woman died because she fucking took protein shakes and she had this inborn genetic error in protein metabolism. I'm like, yeah, okay, well, I don't have that error, so
Yeah, don't have that. No.
irrelevant, you know. But again, just I wanted to say that at the end, just because people can be overly cautious with this stuff because they'll read some random report or, you know, make some mechanistic hypothesizing about some pathway being influenced by this, like, and then they're like, oh no, I'm not going to do this. Like, I've seen people argue that whey protein powder, because it is more insulinogenic, because amino acids as well are insulinogenic, um, contributes to getting acne because it increases IGF-1 levels, and as a result, like that is correlated with acne and stuff. You know, you're like, okay, cool. Like, at the end of the day, this is just not a huge deal. Like, if you notice you start taking a load of whey protein and you get a slight increase in acne, then just take less. Like, it's not like that's not going to influence our general recommendations. That's an individual thing. Like, I know individuals that have had, like, you know, chronic acne their whole life or whatever, and they start taking protein and their acne actually reduced, you know, and we could argue, hypothesize, do whatever, be like, oh, it's glutathione that we have increased, you know, ability to handle whatever stressors, whatever, blah, blah, blah. But ultimately, like we could spend all day hypothesizing about something, but it's not going to influence our recommendation or the outcome itself. It's like, yeah, we're trying to retroactively understand why this happened. That's cool. Yeah, we can definitely do that. But ultimately it happened, and that's going to then influence whether you should continue taking it or stop taking it. And that's all that matters at the end of the day. Like, if you notice you get extra spots, stop taking it. If you notice it actually improves your fucking spots, keep taking it, you know? So if there are all these random conflicting maybes and whatever, like, take it for a while, see what happens for you as an individual. And if it fits in your overall dietary pattern, you're eating relatively well, and you're just using it as a little hitter to make sure that you're getting your protein intake where it needs to be, I'm just not concerned about it.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add, which we already brought up, is that if you are concerned about, like, the quality of your protein supplement, and I think supplements in general, the website that assesses all that stuff is labdoor.com, I believe. And if you go on there, you can basically see stuff. And like Paddy said, like, my protein generally do come out pretty high. And no, we're not paid by my protein to say that, but it is just an interesting observation. The reason we bring that up is because my protein is generally quite cheap, and people generally assume that, oh, that's because their stuff is lower quality, you're better off spending more. Whereas, like, no, not really. Like, you know, they have their stuff in bulk. The packaging is super simple. There's no reckless claims on the bag or anything. Whereas what you're often paying for with some smaller companies in some cases is they're adding in different things that don't really do anything. And you've got real fancy marketing, fancy packaging, etc. And you just don't need that. You just want the protein, you know? So
100%.
labdoor.com.
Yeah, and we're not endorsed by Labdoor. I actually heard some, like, claims against Labdoor that are, I don't know if they were substantiated against being, like, paid under the table, but in general, they appear to be.
I retract my claims. And
but I don't know. I'm not saying, like, I don't want them fucking to sue me or anything and be like,
yeah,
I haven't looked into that. I just
we have no affiliations with anyone, so, like, just, yeah.
Nor do we want one in case someone's thinking about reaching out.
No, thank you.
But yeah, I've nothing else to say really on this. If you take 4 scoops of protein per day, fucking don't care. There might be rationale for that. If you take 4 scoops of protein per day and it's because your diet is shit, I'd probably be more concerned if I were you. But if your diet is shit overall and you're like, oh, I'm going to just supplement with protein, you probably have bigger concerns than just the protein intake. There's a reason why your diet is shit overall, and you're just choosing shit sources. You know, that's probably going to be the last wheel that falls off the wagon. And the fact that you're eating Pop-Tarts for breakfast is probably going to cause more issues than the fact that you are hitting your protein target with whey protein.
I would agree.
Anyway, Gary, where can people find us? What's all that jazz? Do your usual spiel.
Yeah, so if you want to get involved with more of our content, you could subscribe to the Triage Method newsletter down below to see the different articles and videos, etc., that we've produced, as well as the podcasts and recommended resources from around the internet. You can also join the Triage Method community. That's our open access Facebook group, where we have discussions about different topics, post different research papers, people ask questions, we answer them, etc. You can also pre-register your interest for the Coaches Corner. So that's a service we're going to be launching next month for personal trainers in particular, or interested trainees who want to basically go from kind of learning some theory-based stuff to really trying to apply that stuff in practice. So for example, anatomy and exercise mechanics and exercise physiology, how do you take that information and apply it now in practice? And how do you do that for not just you, but for different clients? So for different people that are presenting to you, because that's really one of the missing steps at some points, is that we learn as personal trainers what different exercises work, for example, but we don't really learn how to change those exercises for different individuals, depending on what their goal is, what they present with, what they experience within the workout, and how we can improve that experience of their workout. So yeah, get involved, pre-register your interest. Below, you'll be added to basically just an email list where we will give you an exclusive discount upon launch, but we won't send you any other stuff. We won't bother you with other stuff. You're not committing to anything. You're literally just signing up for a potential discount if you happen to be interested upon launch. So you can do that below. We do have online coaching spaces available. So if you're interested in coaching, you can get involved to work with myself or Paddy. And all that information is below. We've got on site if you'd like to read those to see if we've worked with people maybe in a similar context to you, or you can just email info@triagemethod.com to make an inquiry. There's also an application form on site where you can basically fill in some details, and we'll say, yep, looks like we can, do something to help you out. Or we might say, look, your case maybe isn't something that we specialize in, and here's someone that might be better than us, So other than that, guys, you can subscribe to the YouTube channel, subscribe to the podcast, leave a review, like or follow on Instagram. That's at Triage Method, or at Skinny Gaz, or at The Real Paddy Farrell if you'd like to follow us individually. We've also got a Facebook page, so you can like that if you wish, follow along there. And that's basically everything that we do.
100%, Gary. I have nothing else to say, except it is too easy.
It's too easy.